Hey there, this is your teacher, Mr. H, and you're watching History in a Hoodie. Today's episode is about the people of the New South, where we'll learn all about who shaped the post-Civil War Southern society. I can't wait to find out, so let's get this show started. What are we learning about today? The standard for today's lesson asks the students to identify the ways individuals, groups, and events attempted to shape the New South, including the Bourbon Triumvirate, Henry Grady, the International Cotton Exposition, and Tom Watson's Populists. Additionally, we will explain the roles of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Alonzo Herndon in advancement of the rights of African Americans in the New South era. Before we start, let's go over some vocabulary for today's lesson. Booker T. Washington was the leader of the African American community who suggested economic prosperity would lead to equality. W.E.B. Du Bois was the political activist who campaigned for African Americans to be treated equally. Alonzo Herndon was one of the first African American millionaires in Georgia due to his successful insurance company. The International Cotton Expositions were the World's Fairs held in Atlanta to show off the growth of industry in the South. The New South was Henry Grady's term for industrializing the South. The Bourbon Triumvirate were the trio of Georgia politicians, Brown, Gordon, and Colquitt, who controlled Georgia politics for 20 years and promoted white supremacist laws. Anytime society changes, you're going to see two groups of people: those who welcome the change and those who liked things the way they were. Following the Civil War, the major change, of course, was the end of slavery. There were those who welcomed the end of slavery, the freedmen, obviously, and progressive whites. And also there were those who fought to return things to the way they were, including several Georgian politicians of the era. One economic change that occurred immediately following the Civil War was industrialization. Though cotton was Georgia's major economic activity and had been for nearly a century, forward-thinking individuals started to recognize that the South was being left behind by manufacturing. Henry Grady, a newspaper editor, spent much of the late 1800s promoting industry for Atlanta's rebuild following the war and luring northern businesses to the region. Atlanta was host to the International Cotton Expositions, events that drew in worldwide crowds, and Grady took the opportunity to rebrand Atlanta as the industrial hub of the region and the jewel of the South. Grady coined the term for this time period in his newspaper, the New South. Those working to progress Georgia socially included Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. These two African American leaders wanted to focus on economic, political, and social improvements for all freedmen, but they very much differed on how positive change should be achieved. Booker T. Washington felt that African Americans would earn the respect of whites by keeping quiet and working hard, like how Alonzo Herndon did it, founder of an insurance company and one of Georgia's first African American millionaires. That through economic prosperity, freedmen would gain their equality. Du Bois, on the other hand, felt that equal rights would only come through making a lot of noise, protesting in the streets, and demanding rights. If the only conflict preventing equal rights from being achieved in the 1870s was over the pathway to achieving change, then perhaps equality might have been won faster. However, Washington and Du Bois were not just fighting with each other, but also those politicians who would see society return to the pre-Civil War days. From the 1870s through 1890s, 3 Georgia politicians rotated through the positions as governor and U.S. senator. These 3 men, nicknamed the Bourbon Triumvirate, were all secessionists before the war and white supremacists before, during, and after. Joseph E. Brown, Alfred H. Colquitt, and John B. Gordon passed many of Georgia's segregation laws, making life that much tougher for freedmen. Another politician that had no problem expressing his white supremacist views was Tom Watson. He used his newspaper and magazine, The Jeffersonian, to spread his political views across the South, including hatred for African Americans, Catholics, and Jews as well. These men had no trouble being elected to the Georgia leadership positions because of restrictions of black voting rights, and similar politicians would continue to lead Georgia well into the 20th century. Now what? What am I going to do with this information? Anytime society changes, you're going to see two groups of people. Those who welcome the change and those who like things the way they were. The first group, those who welcomed the change, exist because the old way was uncomfortable for their lives. The second group, those who like things the way they were, exist because the new way is uncomfortable for their lives. Whenever a change is needed, someone is going to be uncomfortable. Let's be honest. In some of these cases, uncomfortable is the politically correct term here. So how does society decide whose discomfort is more important? My grandparents were particularly resistant to the internet age. Gramps was perfectly happy getting all of his news from the TV and newspaper. Grandma never felt the need to learn more about the world around her, so she stuck to her reality TV shows. But as the world became more dependent on the internet, online shopping, government forums, up to the second stock market information, they got dragged kicking and screaming into the internet age. The internet made them uncomfortable because of the whole can't teach an old dog new tricks thing. And yet, as we all know, the internet has made a world more efficient and open place. In the case of this change, the costs and benefits were weighed. It may have been difficult for elderly folks like my grandparents, but transitioning to a connected world has resulted in so much more benefits. The end of slavery was an extremely difficult change for Southern whites, because it made them very uncomfortable. However, the benefits of freedom for an entire race of people outweigh the cost of the discomfort for Southern whites significantly. That's not to say that those people on the difficult side of change are going to readily accept it just because the federal government has a point. How many times have you been told it's for your own good, but still resented being forced to do something you didn't want? Same for the Southerners. Wow, so learning about New South leaders is really important for us to understand. I'm glad we learned it today. Are you ready for some review questions? Henry Grady was known as the voice of the New South. What was meant by this statement? The International Cotton Exposition showed the world that Georgia was... Who was W.E.B. Du Bois? I hope all of you learned a lot from today's episode of History in a Hoodie about the leaders in the New South era. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Just kidding, I don't care about that stuff. But do make sure you study this lesson. Bye now.